I remember they would tell me, and sometimes they would sort of tear up, how when I was 8 years old, my parents had to watch me go in for surgery for something that I was born with. Pediatric surgeries, pediatric anesthesia, the dangers, the need for it. We're going to talk about that today. We're also going to be talking about the dangers of fentanyl. It's a useful drug in the right hands, but what happens when the kid wants to be like grandpa and that patch is sitting there? Also, should children participate in clinical trials? It's all about kids today. Should children participate in clinical trials? Should your kid participate in a clinical trial? We'll talk about that, as well as internships. We're going to have a little fireside chat. We're going to sit down. Maybe you're interested in an internship. We'll tell you what you should be thinking about, maybe how you can land that, how it can lead to something more. All this coming up next on MedTech Crossroads. Should my child participate in a clinical trial? What are they for? What's the benefit? Am I going to get paid for that? Is my child going to get better faster? How do these things work? Well, it turns out the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has a new article out on this, which we have up on the iPad. Should your child participate in a clinical trial? I think a lot of times as parents, and I have a bunch of kids myself, as parents, we think to ourselves, especially when our child is in danger, we think, if I can just get them to the doctor, everything will be okay. The doctor knows what to do. Well, it turns out as parents, I think sometimes we need to wake up and realize that decisions have to be made, and the doctor can't make all of those decisions. They don't always know exactly what is in our child's best interest. And FDA is actually calling our attention to that in this article. The picture here of the teddy bear, of course, with the mask and the stethoscope, getting great care from one of our many healthcare practitioners, and that's really fun. But here's what it is. What is it? What is a clinical trial? Well, if your child enrolls in a pediatric clinical trial, they could be offered an experimental product that may or may not be better than those already being used. Now, they're more focused than ever on the potential clinical benefit, that justifies the risk of using the experimental product. It's possible to do a clinical trial without any benefit. If you just want to know, is this acceptable? Is it tolerable? But in general, with children, we don't allow that. There's really supposed to be a benefit for the use of the device. In addition, the children who participate generally must have the disease or condition being studied. Now, what we'll see is that there's exceptions to all of these things, which means that, and remember this, these are voluntary. Clinical trials are voluntary. You do not have to participate in a clinical trial. Under limited circumstances, children may be exposed to the risks of an experimental medical product that doesn't offer any potential clinical benefit, but it's got to be low risk. And the information to be gained must be important to understanding or treating the children's disease or condition. That sounds great. That sounds like the right principle. That sounds like we're doing exactly the right thing here. And at a high level, I think we are. Our kids are precious, and we want to make sure that we're taking good care of them and not doing experimentation without potential benefit, without information. Now, of course, informed consent is required in all clinical trials, but in this case especially, it's important that the parents know what is happening here. But I want to draw your attention to this. This kind of language, while it is aspirational, I can tell you as a medical product developer, when we encounter the need for testing and the need for clinical testing, things are never quite as clear as you'd like to think it is. If you have engineers and doctors working on something, they must know exactly what's going on. They must have this perfect sense of it. And of course, that's not true. So when a trial is designed, it's done hopefully in good faith and with best practices. But the reason that FDA is drawing attention to this is because they recognize that not everything is as cut and dried as it seems. So why even allow clinical trials on children? Why not just say, do it on adults? Well, in large part, unfortunately, that's what we have in this country is a lot of adult devices being used on pediatrics. And as we're going to talk about later on today's show, this is not always a good thing because devices that are safe and effective on adults could be dangerous on peds or vice versa. So by necessity, as it says here, FDA says here, doctors may routinely treat children with a drug or a device that's been studied in adults and approved for adult use, but may not have been studied in children, or may have been studied in a different group of children. The demographics that you study are really, really important. So as it turns out, clinical trials in children can be important for increasing safety and availability of products to children whom today might be being treated with adult devices that really are not suited for them or designed for them. FDA has this advice for parents. And again, nothing here, medical or legal advice from us, but this is directly out of FDA's mouth. Ask questions. Write down a list of questions and take it with you when you meet the investigator in charge of the clinical trial. Some examples include, what's the evidence that the investigational product might help my child? If this might not help your child, why would you be doing it? How will you check to see if the investigational product is working? How are you going to know if this is working? Are there any concerns that the investigational product could be unsafe? Maybe you want to ask what kind of safety testing has been done on the device to date. How closely will my child be monitored if there are problems? Who do I call if I'm concerned that there is a problem? Now, this is a topic I'm going to bring up, and I want to bring it up very carefully because in no way do we want to throw the practitioners and the investigators in our wonderful hospitals and healthcare systems under the bus at all. So many of them are laboring in conditions that sometimes we cannot imagine to care for us and for our children. I've met so many researchers in our career who are passionate about finding better solutions. They see sometimes how barbaric what we do in hospitals can be, and they want to make it better. And that's what drives good clinical research. That's what drives good product development. But it is true that investigators have a built-in conflict of interest. They're interested in seeing their study through. Patient enrollment is often a challenging thing. And it could be, I'm not saying it is in every case, but it could be a temptation to gloss over some of these things. Now, the Institutional Review Board is responsible to make sure that informed consent happens. So it should be happening. This is not meant as a scare tactic at all. But FDA is telling us, talk to the investigator. Talk to the investigator in charge. Get yourself satisfied. Now, of course, as a medical device developer, I don't really want to say anything that's going to dissuade you from participating in a clinical trial. Because if we have a device that we're trying to get to market, I'd really like it to make it through clinical trials. But it remains, this is a voluntary activity. You as a parent need to believe that this clinical trial is going to help your child, that it provides a reasonable boost, that your time and the effort that you're spending to participate in it is really going to provide some potential benefit to your child and going to help research and going to help people down the road. That's really the upside for everybody. Take notes during the discussion. Can I tell you what I think this is about? And you tell me if I'm right or not. The read back. I think we should all do more of this. Can I tell you what I think this is about? And you tell me if I'm right or not. FDA is recommending this. Talk to your investigator. Tell them, I think this is what I heard. Did I get it right? Ask for contact information for other parents whose children are participating in the trial. Take your time. Don't just let somebody shove a document in your face. This is not legal advice, but as a parent, we've encountered this many times. Here's a bunch of documents. Please sign them. You have to do this to get care. Well, that's usually not quite true. Follow your instincts. If you're not satisfied, don't enroll your child. This isn't our advice. This is what FDA is telling you. Clinical trials are voluntary. You can enroll, you can drop out. Although I will say if you have to drop out, it can be a detriment to the study. So it's good to have your questions answered as much as possible up front. It's important to talk to the study team. You may need to follow up just to make sure there aren't any side effects from the investigational product. FDA has gone so far about a year ago as to produce a draft guidance for the ethical considerations for clinical investigations of medical products involving children. And I applaud them for taking this step. I think what you're going to see, though, is that this is why FDA is saying, hey, parents, ask questions, satisfy yourself, make sure your child is being taken care of in a way that you are happy with. Because some of these things, while they're aspirational and they are the right thing to be saying, sometimes it feels like you could drive a truck through them. How do we know if we're really asking the right questions in a trial? We're doing it in good faith, but maybe it's not right for you and for your family. There's various parts of the Code of Federal Regulations, we won't look at all of them, that apply to this. Clinical investigations not involving greater than minimal risk. No greater than minimal risk. And later on, they define what that means. And adequate provisions for soliciting the assent of the children and the permission of their parents or guardians. That's a requirement. That's an ethical consideration. Ensconced in 21 CFR 50.51. There are provisions for clinical investigations involving greater than minimal risk, but the prospect of direct benefit, which means that if you're going to have a little more risk and just a little more risk, as you find out later in the guidance document, it's okay, but there better really be some benefit to it. The prospect of direct benefit, the risk represents a minor increase over minimal risk. They do define that later, but as you can see, that might be a little bit easy to fudge. So it's important that you as a parent understand what they believe the risk of the device or the drug is. The intervention or procedure presents experiences to subjects that are reasonably commensurate with those inherent in their actual or expected medical, dental, physiological, social, or educational situations. You don't want to put people way out of their way. The intervention or procedure is likely to yield generalizable knowledge about the subject's disorder or condition that's of vital importance for the understanding or amelioration of the subject's disorder or condition. That, as a principle, absolutely agree. As a principle, I think our researchers and our doctors agree. But I will say, what does vital importance mean? Is it really vital to you as a parent? Is it vital to them as a researcher? Is it truly vital, or is it a convenient thing to do? All of these factors come into play when you're designing a clinical trial. And so you as a parent want to ensure that you're comfortable with what's happening. Adequate provisions for soliciting the assent of the children and the permission of their parents or guardians. They should have data. You should be able to ask questions about it. There's also a principle of scientific necessity. Now, there was something called the Belmont Report, specifically that of justice, the ethical principles of that, specifically the principle of justice. IRBs should consider the scientific necessity of conducting a clinical investigation in children. You might want to consider that prior to assessing benefit and risk. They shouldn't be enrolled unless you need it to answer an important scientific question. Because if you could do it in adults and that would be sufficient and you could answer the question in adults, you shouldn't be enrolling children. But like we said at the outset, there are so many devices where they're actually using adult devices in children. They know it's not the best thing that they could be doing. And so people go out there and they try to develop devices for use in children, wanting to bring the best care to our children, then needing to test them on children. It's appropriate. In the right context, it can be safe. And the real question there is, hey, parent, you're part of this process. It's voluntary, something that you can say yes or no to. Make sure that you're asking questions to where you're satisfied so you can be an enthusiastic participant in clinical trials that are going to make pediatric devices safer for our children. Now, this isn't just for the parents. I happen to be both a parent and someone who works in the medical device development field. And I'll tell you, as device developers who are targeting pediatric devices, our job is hard enough as it is. Pediatric devices usually have very small markets. They're often worked on as passion projects because somebody lost a loved one because the device wasn't available, or because a caregiver just can't stand to see what patients, pediatric patients, are being put through day after day, and they want to see something better. But as a result, we need to be cognizant of some of these extra limitations. We can't just go into a clinical trial thinking that the normal rules of clinical trials apply, because pediatric patients have an extra standard of care associated with clinical trials that they're involved in. So as device developers, we need to think, if we're going to design a clinical trial using pediatric patients, do we really need the information that we're looking for? Could we get it some other way? There will be extra roadblocks. And we want to make sure that those devices get out there to the patients that they're intended to care for, but we don't want to miss some of the hurdles that are there as a part of these regulations and guidances, and really just common sense. We want to make sure that we're not putting kids under situations where there's not a lot of potential for tangible benefit. If you like what you just heard, please like and subscribe on YouTube. We love our listeners and we love the interactions we've been getting on MedTech Crossroads. As always, we want to save you time on your MedTech development journey. That's why MedTech Crossroads is here. Please let us know how we can make it better. Thanks for being with us today. When I was 8 days old, my parents had to let me go to a surgery that was to save my life. Part of me was falling out. TMI, not what you wanted to know. But many of you as parents have been in that kind of a situation. Letting your child go back into surgery as an infant, as a toddler, hoping for the best. More than 1 million children a year under the age of 5, this from FDA, undergo surgical procedures requiring anesthesia in the United States. The most common procedures include ear tubes for chronic infection, tonsillectomy, hernia repair, and circumcision. And as it turns out, anesthesia, we knew this. We knew this. As adults, we knew this. Anesthesia is not safe. General anesthesia is not completely safe. Bad things can happen. But that's why we have anesthesiologists. They research this, they learn about it, they practice their art, and they do their best to take care of us, as well as our children. We're thankful for them. But here's the problem. Animal research has been showing that anesthesia in young animals creates things like brain damage later on that you can measure. The question then becomes, does this translate to children? We sort of know what the effects on adults are, and many of us have been through surgeries with anesthesia. But in pediatrics, are we subjecting our kids to undue risks? Do we really understand the magnitude of the risks that they're going through when they undergo anesthesia as infants? So the US FDA and the International Anesthesia Research Society have created strategies for mitigating anesthesia-related neurotoxicity in tots, or SMART tots. I suppose it's a better acronym than MEDUFA. I always love MEDUFA, Medical Device User Fee Act. So SMART tots is going to coordinate and fund research to make surgery, anesthesia, and sedation safer for infants and young children. I have to applaud the FDA here. They're acknowledging that there's the potential for a danger. They're not saying panic, stop doing surgeries on children. They specifically call that out. They say, no, we need to keep doing what we're doing because a surgery should only happen anyways if it's essential, if it's necessary to preserve the life and health of that child. So the question they're asking now is there more we can learn about anesthesia in infants and young children? So here's the Smart Tots website, funding research to ensure pediatric anesthesia safety. If you're somebody who's had a child under anesthesia, there's places where you can go as a parent. In this, under the resources section, there's a newsletter if you want to stay up to date on anesthesia research. Maybe you're a MedTech company involved in surgical devices. Maybe you're involved in anesthesia delivery and you want to know more about this growing field. Because be sure that if they discover a correlation, things are going to have to change. The practice will have to change. And hat goes off to their research. There's not a lot we know today. There's a couple of questions on their FAQ which I wanted to bring to your attention. How did the concerns about the safety of anesthetic drugs for infants and young children arise? Well, one of the FDA's centers, as well as investigators at several universities, conducted research to study the effects of anesthetics on the nervous systems of developing animals. That's right here. This research demonstrated that exposure to some anesthetics and sedatives caused memory and learning difficulties and other harmful changes in the central nervous system of some laboratory animals. So, yeah, that's worth probably studying more. But, get this, currently inadequate data exist to prove or disprove whether similar effects occur in children. So no one is saying that we know that this is going to harm children. I've been involved in the past on research using animals, and it doesn't always correlate. It doesn't always correlate. When we think, oh, it's a biological system, it must behave the same way, it's not always true. So I think we do have to take all of this with a grain of salt. This is good precaution. This is good research to do. But please do not go out and freak out that because animals were affected by anesthesia, that children necessarily will be. It's amazing how different biological systems are, and I've seen that firsthand. Should we be concerned about risks to humans? Well, yes, I think it's wise to ask the question, but the studies have been mixed. Studies have not found a link between development of learning disabilities in children and the use of anesthetics. However, some study data have linked learning disabilities and behavioral problem with anesthetics administered in infants and children prior to 3 years of age. So they have a newsletter archive and a bi-monthly newsletter that you can subscribe to learn more. What can we learn as a development community? Well, I think we have to stay abreast of these things, because if we're involved in surgery, if we're involved in anesthetic delivery, we need to pay attention to know how the landscape is changing and what FDA thinks about it. Because you better believe that FDA, when they ask us during a submission, hey, how are you dealing with this question? You're going to have an answer. And so it's good to stay abreast of these kinds of things. If you like what you just heard, either as a parent or as a medical device developer or an investor or someone who's part of the MedTech community, please be sure to like and subscribe to us on YouTube. MedTech Crossroads is intended to save you time and headaches in your MedTech product development journey. So we want you to be happy with what you're hearing here. Keep the cards and letters coming so we can make segments that are useful to you and to those that you work with and to those that you love. Every little kid wants to be like parents, grandparents, people they admire, look up to. But what happens when grandpa is always wearing this little patch on his arm? And the kid sees it and says, I want to be like grandpa. What if that's a fentanyl patch? It's an opioid. We have an opioid epidemic in the US, but there are still useful uses, legal, useful ways to use things like fentanyl patches for the alleviation of chronic pain. But what happens when little Johnny or Sarah grabs that patch and sticks it on, even if it's a used patch, or maybe it's one that they discovered somewhere? That can be toxic and fatal. So FDA is drawing attention to this as well. Accidental exposure to fentanyl patches continue to be deadly to children. Fentanyl patch safety from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. These things can look like a Band-Aid. I tell you what, in our house, we have a box of Band-Aids in the closet, and it is always in complete disarray. You know why? Because my kids, every time they get a little scratch, they run to that closet and they grab a Band-Aid and they stick it on. And I'm glad they feel that they can get some care by sticking that Band-Aid on. But guess what? If that Band-Aid and that fentanyl patch look the same and they're stored in the same place, we have a problem. Because the exposure to fentanyl can be deadly. The fentanyl transdermal system, marketed under the brand named Duragesic, also available as a generic product, is a patch prescribed by healthcare professionals to be applied to the skin. The patch treats opioid-tolerant patients who need daily, round-the-clock, long-term pain medicine by releasing fentanyl through the skin over the course of treatment. The patch is generally replaced every 3 days. They can put them in their mouth, stick the patches on their skin. It slows their breathing down and decreases the levels of oxygen in children's blood. Turns out there is a drug, naloxone, that can be had on hand that can be given even to a child to fight an overdose of something like an opioid like fentanyl. So if you got patches around, maybe that's a good thing to do as well. It goes without saying, I didn't even copy the sections out because I feel like it goes without saying. These things should be stored, locked away, out of reach. They should also be secured, FDA says. If you're wearing a fentanyl patch, you should be placing an additional cover over it, putting the kid away to bed for the night and the patch falls off. That, coming in contact, getting stuck to their skin, can be enough to be deadly. FDA recommends, and this is where it gets interesting, folks, the FDA recommends promptly disposing of used patches by folding them in half with the sticky sides together and then flushing them down a toilet. Does that strike anyone else as a little odd? Well, what are they doing? They're saying don't place them in the household trash because kids can get a hold of them in the household trash. So they might grab them there. Yeah, I get it. This brings us to drug disposal, the FDA's flush list for certain medicines. I did not know before we did this story that FDA has a flush list for certain medicines. FDA is actively instructing any drug that contains the word buprenorphine, fentanyl, hydrocodone, benzihydrocodone, hydromorphone, I didn't practice this beforehand, meperidine, methadone, morphine, oxycodone, oxymorphone, tapentadol, sodium oxybate or sodium oxybates, as well as a couple of others. These are on the flush list. If there's no collection site near you, FDA says the best thing you can do is not to dispose of these in the trash, but to flush them. And what gets me is I think we're in a bit of a mixed bag situation. They're going right into the water system. They're going right into the water system. Is this a good idea? Well, at least FDA is asking the question. There is an article, Risks Associated with the Environmental Release of Pharmaceuticals on the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Flush List. There's the potential for harm from leftover medicines. And FDA is saying, we don't want these in your house anymore. If there's no take-back program, flush them. But what's the environmental health relevance of the recommendation to flush? This water gets treated, but are these things removed from it? It goes out to the streams and rivers and lakes, to animals, back to our drinking water eventually. How safe is that? FDA has done studies on this, and they seem kind of limited. I'll be frank, saying that we don't think there's a lot of issue here, but it requires more research. So, inasmuch as it's interesting for us to talk about fentanyl patches and how do we protect our children from them, I think we also need to be talking about the environmental impact of the drugs and devices that we release back into the environment. Now, before we leave fentanyl patches entirely, this brings up an interesting topic for medical device developers. As parents, we don't want our kids to be poisoned by grandpa's fentanyl patch, so we need to take precautions. But as medical device developers, it opens up the whole question of risk management, reasonably foreseeable risks. In the world of risk management, especially under ISO 14971, the International Risk Management Standard, there are different ways that you can manage risk in a device. One of the ways is inherent safety by design. If there's no way for a person to be hurt by the device, or for the wrong person to be hurt by the device, that's the best situation to be in. If that is not possible, putting in safety mechanisms would be the next step to take. And if you're thinking about a fentanyl patch, you're thinking to yourself, yeah, there's probably not a lot more we can do. But maybe somebody out there thinking about the opioid crisis, maybe somebody out there who's been impacted by it, maybe somebody out there who's close enough to touch the MedTech development world. Maybe you're thinking about these two things colliding together and you're saying to yourself, maybe there is a way to make something like a fentanyl patch inherently safe by design. Maybe there is a way to make a fentanyl patch have safety mechanisms that would protect against unintentional contact with pediatrics, for example. But barring those two, all you're left with is labeling, and it's a reluctant third. Labeling is required, and even in a sense, although it's not technically labeling, FDA coming out here and warning people about it is an effort to get the word out, to spread the word. If you didn't read the instructions for use, maybe we'll get to you through the FDA website, these articles. Maybe you heard it on MedTech Crossroads and it'll get to you. Well, the labeling is what comes with the device on the website for the device. But if it's not clear enough, at least as MedTech developers, we should be reviewing whether people can understand that labeling so that we stay out of situations like this at least as much as we can. Well, if that was helpful to you as a parent or a MedTech developer, the discussion on labeling, risk management, reasonably foreseeable misuse, ways to mitigate risks, inherent safety by design, safety measures, or labeling, we hope you will like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. MedTech Crossroads is here to save you time and headaches on your medical product. There you go, your medical product development journey. So we hope that this segment did that for you today. Keep the cards and letters coming. We'd love to know what you'd like us to talk about or who you'd like us to talk with on MedTech Crossroads. He leans in. This is the fireside chat one. I'll bring the iPad up there. So, you want an internship. Don't have any slides for you. Just me, just you. We're going to talk about this. A lot of people approach us at Into Being and say, can I have an internship? I've been studying, and I'd really like to intern with your company. Now, before the COVID pandemic, that was something that we could frequently say yes to. What we've been finding over the pandemic, obviously without in-person, 2020 and stuff like that, it was really, really hard to bring interns in. Now that's starting to happen again across the board. I think you'll find companies are open to you asking them for an internship. But guess what? It's gotten harder still because companies are busy. Left and right, we are hearing that companies are swamped. Lead times are going out. And you think to yourself, well, if lead times are going up and you're swamped, don't you want interns? Here's the hard part. Companies recognize that interns rarely deliver value when they're there at the company. That's the chance to find out that this person could be a great fit with the company. The internship is going to be wonderful. It's going to be great for you. Hopefully the company gets a little something out of it, but oftentimes they're done in good faith to try to build the community and to try to see if you're a good candidate for future hiring. So they're wonderful to do. They're important. They're important for our community. But it means that you, as an internship candidate, need to have a sense of what the company is up against, what the company is looking for. And if a company like Into Being, if we're any indication, when a company is busy and churning through great projects, we want to mentor people. But there are some things that are really important to bring to the table. And not just to bring to the table from the perspective of on your resume, but to bring to the table in a sense that when people look at you and talk with you, it's oozing out of every pore. We can tell that this is who you are down deep. And before we talk about that list of things, let's talk about what kinds of majors might be interesting to a company like Into Being, a company in medical and life science product development. Here we are at Into Being. We're doing mechanical, electrical, software design. We're doing vendor management. We're doing regulatory strategy and regulatory submissions to the FDA. We're doing design for manufacturability, doing lots of prototyping, as well as working with vendors later on to develop medical devices for our clients. So what might you want to have as a degree that you're working on coming in the door and saying, hey, I'd really like an internship? Well, biomedical engineering is an easy one. Biomedical engineers often find a place at companies like Into Being, as well as mechanical, electrical, and software engineers. There's often space for people who are just really, really good with their hands and have always had a penchant for building things. The more things, the better. Embedded systems is a growing point of interest. If you've been really good in your early years building things with Arduinos and Teensies and other programmable systems, but not just throwing the code at it, actually getting the sensors to work and the LEDs because you built a little robot and then you went beyond that. There seems to be a trend among people who love to hack coffee makers. When we hear things like that about you, we're interested. It's not just what you did on paper. It's not just the classes you took. It's what are you passionate about in these kinds of fields, and how have you applied it up till now? It's also how do you work with people? If you think we don't want to hear about your summer at the ice cream shop, that's probably not true. We want to know how you interacted with your coworkers, how you interacted with your boss. We want to know what sorts of challenges you faced and what sorts of things you overcame. We're going to be looking as we think about that with you at what kind of a person you are. How do you attack problems? How willing are you to run into situations and learn things, but not run beyond your abilities? Companies today are overwhelmed. They're busier than ever here at the end of 2023. If they're going to think about you for an eventual position, they need to know where they can plug you in as fast as possible and you can be effective as close to day one as possible. Training is important, but it's oftentimes only the large companies that have the luxury of training you for 6 to 18 months before you really find your home inside the company. When you read job postings, you'll read things like team player, self-starter, goal-oriented, details-oriented. I remember looking at job postings and being frustrated by these kinds of comments. So let me see if I can unpack them for you for just a minute. What are companies actually looking for when they say these sorts of things? Team player, that's an interesting one. I like to think back to the day when beautiful pocket watches could be built by a single person over the course of days or weeks, or maybe even longer. A single trained jeweler can create something of amazing beauty. They can find ways to create things that work for them, tricks of the trade that are beautiful, integrated into their workflow. It doesn't need to work for anybody else. It just has to work for them. It's the craftsman mentality, and it's a beautiful thing to behold. I hope nobody goes away thinking that I'm tearing down those who can craft such amazing things. And there's a place for the craftsperson mentality in medical device development, especially when it comes to new ideas and trying things really fast, down and dirty solutions to find out if we're on the right track. So don't lose that spark. But when a company is looking for a team player, They're looking for somebody who won't just ride roughshod over everybody else, who will understand the needs of the stakeholders around the table, who will take their amazing talents and who will allow them to blend in right measure, letting them out at the right rate to work with the people around you. So if it's my way or the highway, it's probably the highway. But if your way can be let out in the right increments when you see the need, suggestions can be made, ideas offered to a receptive audience, it takes two to tango. That's more of what it means to be a team player. Self-starter. Some people, many people, are waiting around for someone to give them a job. Tell me what to do, and I'll turn the crank. Actually, that's exceptionally valuable. There's many times when what is needed is simply a willingness to attack what is there when you're told what it is. And it's enough to wait for someone to tell you what to do. There are many roles where that is completely appropriate, and to do otherwise might not actually be a great idea. Not so in the MedTech development world, because what we're trying to do is bring everything together. It wouldn't do to have a conductor in a symphony who had to tell the violinist, I want you to play this part. The violinist better come prepared to play that part, to anticipate what's going to be needed, and to start when it's necessary, looking to the conductor for subtle cues as to how this all goes together. To be a self-starter means to look for opportunities. It means to try things. Again, there's a fine balance between riding roughshod over other people and finding your place and then playing your instrument to its maximum. If you're thinking about an internship with a company like IntoBeing or any MedTech company, I encourage you to think about all the things that you've done, the places where you've gone out on your own initiative to do something really cool, or something maybe you don't think is cool, but it shows that initiative. And it shows how you took that initiative, tempered it with the needs of others, and came to solutions for whoever you are working with. What about goal-oriented and detail-oriented? Well, like the last thing we talked about, I just need a job. You need to be goal-oriented and detail-oriented in MedTech product development, whether it's an internship or a position. It means you have to have an understanding of what it is that people are asking for. It's not enough to say, I did work on it, and I'll do more work next week. The question is, what are you trying to accomplish? What would success look like? All the way from early stage prototyping to late stage medical device testing, verification, and validation, knowing what you are trying to accomplish is of paramount importance. I've seen too many meetings happen in other organizations where people walk into a room, argue for more than the allotted hour, and walk out with everybody agreeing to do more work on it. Nothing's going to come out of that next week. What is the goal? What are the details that need to be accomplished? Some of the best examples that I've seen are people who will walk into a meeting with a notebook and walk out only when their list of action items has been reviewed with everybody of concern in that meeting. You know that you're going to get what you're looking for. So if you're thinking about an internship or a position with a company like IntoBeing or another MedTech development company, please think about these things. Think about how you can demonstrate not just what you did, not just the hours you worked. Don't shy away from volunteer opportunities. Don't shy away from things that you think, well, that wasn't engineering, that wasn't science. That's okay. We want to hear about it. Because what a company like ours is looking for is to understand who you are as a person, how you'll fit on that team, how you will drive as hard as you can, but not drive over people, how you'll work with that group, make sure that you understand what their needs are, make sure that they understand what yours are. That's important too. And that you'll walk out actually moving the ball forward. I can't tell you how many times we've run into situations where teams don't know how to move the ball forward. And that is really the goal of a development process. If this is interesting to you, I hope that you'll like and subscribe to our channel on MedTech Crossroads. Speaking of communicating, there you go. Please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. As always, MedTech Crossroads is meant to save you time and effort in your medical product development journey. So please tell us how we can do better. Tell us topics that you're interested in. Give us the feedback. We love it. Well, due to time today, we're not going to be talking about upcoming events, but the fall is upon us. Events are happening left and right. I know that the MishBio Summit is happening next Monday. But with that, I want to thank you for being here with us on MedTech Crossroads. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.